I was talking to Josh before the show, and I was like, can you believe that this Redskins thing made it to the Supreme Court? And he was like, well, a couple of years ago they ruled on the baseball steroids. I said, yeah, but back then we had a lot more peace and harmony in this world. Like, maybe they were bored looking for things. Like, I feel like there's a lot of other things in this world that they could be zoning in on rather than this. But pretty interesting story. John McMullen's writing about it at FanRag Sports NFL, where he writes a national column and, of course, covers the Eagles for us on 97.3 ESPN. So, John, give us a little background on this. You know, how did it get to the Supreme Court? I mean, this is a pretty big story to get that far, and really the impact of their decision.
Well, first off, the actual court case did not involve the Redskins. It involved a rock band, an Asian American rock band who calls themselves the Slants, and they had their trademark denied by the U.S. government because they thought it was disparaging to Asian Americans. So while the case itself was not involved with the Redskins part of it was the fact that the U.S. District Court in Richmond, which was hearing the Redskins case about their own trademark, was waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on this particular one to set the precedent, basically. So they ruled 8-0 in favor of the band that they should have been able to have the trademark. So people can't argue it was partisan. We always talk in our world about how bad things are and how often the court is 5-4 directly down partisan lines. That was not the case here because it was basically a legal no-brainer. And obviously for people that are upset about the Redskins nickname, that's a very disappointing loss. But it's not a loss to say they can't stop protesting, they can't stop asking the team to change. It's just a matter of you can't do it by backdoor legal means, and that's essentially what the government was trying to do.
Right. So from a legal perspective here, basically they were saying that, hey, these guys are not in the wrong for using this name, and therefore anybody who's in a similar situation that are having protesters or people that are not happy have kind of won today.
Yeah, from the government standpoint, it was a really weak case. Their argument was that trademarks are sort of government speech instead of private speech, which is, if you think about it, is absurd. That would make every trademark in the country, be it McDonald's, ESPN Radio, what we're on right now, all of those trademarks would be government speech, and obviously that's not the case. And that's why you have that rare unanimous decision on the Supreme Court. But again, it's strictly from a legal definition. It doesn't mean you can't continue to protest it and things of that nature. But the fact that what was really going on from the Obama administration, which was the one that set this into, fast forward, was they were trying to take the trademark away so the Redskins would have no legal recourse for counterfeit merchandise. In other words, they have no trademark, so you, Pete, I, anybody could make Redskins T-shirts and make money off it. And their theory was at some point Daniel Snyder would, to protect the brand, would change the name. And essentially that was the back door that I was talking about.
Now, that's interesting. I wasn't, aware of that. And by the way, the Redskins attorney, Lisa Blatt, she did make a statement saying the team is thrilled with today's unanimous decision as it resolves the Redskins' long-standing dispute with the government. This has been going on really since 2014, right?
Yeah, really far before that. But 2014 is when they denied the trademark, and they had approved it many times in the past. And that was another hypocritical part, because if you look at some of the trademarks the government has approved over the years, a lot of them are not good and far worse than the Washington Redskins. So it was always going to be a tough hill for them to win. And, it was one of those things. It was almost the Redskins kind of knew at the end of the day they were going to win the case. It was just a matter of when.
John, Mike asked before we had you on, isn't there more important things for the Supreme Court to worry about? Aren't there more important decisions that they should be doing? But how much of this has to do with the fact that it's the Washington Redskins and it wasn't a team, say, in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest? I mean, it's right in their backyard. Does that have anything that adds credence to why that's in the topic of conversation over and over again?
No, from their standpoint, it has nothing to do with it because the Redskins weren't even involved in the case. It just affects the Redskins. Again, the case was about an Asian American rock band. It really had nothing to do with the Washington Redskins other than they were in the same situation. So ultimately, where the Redskins were in their case was the federal court, the appeals court. Whether the Supreme Court would have heard that case had it gotten that far, we don't know because they're not going to have to now because the appeals court, as I said, was waiting for their decision. It's pretty evident what they have to do, and if they don't do it, it's going to be overturned on appeal.
We're talking with John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, covers the Eagles, national columnist for the NFL, FanRag Sports NFL. John, there was ESPN.com, top 30 defenses in the last 30 years. You've covered the league for a long time. The 1991 Philadelphia Eagles, a team that won Skedaddle, ranked number 1 at the top of that list. Give us a little background on that defense and some great defenses that you have covered in the past. And do you think the Eagles' 91 defense deserves top billing?
I don't. They certainly deserve to be top 5. I would say certainly top 10, even top 5. But you're right. I mean, to me, I look at that Baltimore Ravens defense that won the Super Bowl with Ray Lewis. That's the best defense I've seen in the modern generation. You could argue the Tampa Bay defense that won when John Gruden was there is in the conversation. But that Eagles group was very good. It was a Football Outsiders list ranking the top defenses. So it was mainly, skewed towards analytics. And, hey, I mean, to me, winning the whole thing adds something to it. I think that's fair to say. And the fact that the Eagles obviously didn't takes them down a peg or two. But there's no denying that's one of the great groups of all time. I would never argue with that.
We should point out, John, that list was from 87 on, so a lot of people always like to throw up the 85 Bears and that defense.
Or the 86 Giants.
Mm-hmm. But 87 on was when that list was from.
Well, and you go back to the 70s. I mean, you have to put all those great defenses, the Steel Curtain in Pittsburgh, the Fearsome Foursome in Los Angeles, the Purple People Eaters in Minnesota. They certainly had the best nicknames in the 70s, I will say that.
Well, Gang Green was pretty good.
Yeah, that was pretty good. And, hey, I mean, you talk about, Reggie White and Seth Joyner and all the guys on that team. Hey, it's one of the best of all time. A lot of people will say Reggie is the best defensive lineman of all time. So that alone carries a ton of cachet for that defense. And it is tremendous any way you look at it. But I think to be considered amongst the best of all time, it's the same thing with quarterbacks we talk about all the time. If you don't win the Super Bowl, you're not at that level. I'm sorry.
Jerome Brown, Clyde Simmons also on that defense. Did you ever get to, in your career, John?
Seth Joyner, Byron Evans, come on, Willie T, Ben Smith, Wes Hopkins, Andre Waters.
Dirty Waters,
Woo.
Great names up and down. Did you ever get to interview Bud Carson, who was the architect of that defense in your time, John?
I did. Bud, interestingly, just won the Pro Football Writers Assistant Coach, the Paul Zimmerman Award. He was one of the great, obviously, defensive coordinators of all time. And one of those guys who didn't succeed as a head coach. So I think he kind of gets lost in history a little bit because of that. But there's some guys, and maybe this city knows it more than most. Jim Johnson, obviously being another one of those who are just really, really great coordinators, assistant coaches. And there's a skill to that. There's a science to it. And the great coordinators, to me, one of the worst things about the Pro Football Hall of Fame is that they do not sort of reward those guys. And I think there's so many that they should.
Yeah, John.
Eric Allen was on that team,
Eric
too,
Allen,
by
too.
the way.
Mike Pitts.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, you said Byron Evans.
Yep.
He had 100 tackles by himself that year.
Yeah, that team was Ben Smith was the kid from Georgia they drafted, was the safety. He was like the young guy on that team. They had all those pieces, and they had Hopkins and Waters, and then Allen. Isel Jenkins, I think, was on that team. And then the front four, I mean, you had Simmons, White, Jerome Brown, and then Pitts and Golick were the two.
Don't forget about Andy Harmon.
Was he on the 91 team, Andy Harmon?
He was on that 91 team.
Okay, yeah,
yes,
that was quite a defense there. But, they don't let you play defense like that anymore, John. I mean, that defense wouldn't be nearly as good anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. It is. It really is. And that's why, I think a lot of the newer generation doesn't understand how difficult it was for offenses back in the day. So when you look at some Hall of Fame quarterbacks, for instance, and you look at their statistics next to the quarterbacks of today, you go, what are you thinking, putting Ken Stabler in the Hall of Fame? That people just don't understand. I mean, you were allowed to play defense back then. You were allowed to beat people up. You were allowed to hit. You were allowed to intimidate. And that, obviously, I think that one word defines those Eagle defenses more than any others, the fact that they intimidated people.
They sure did. They were talking about it this morning, and Golick was talking about how that 91 team, for the people out there who were trying to figure out which one that was the Cunningham year where Bryce Paup took him out in game number 1, like the second quarter.
Eagles won the game, but then lost the season, if you will.
Yeah, they had Brad Gable and Jack Kemp and Pat Ryan and Jim McMahon.
Jack Kemp was the senator.
Jack Kemp, who cares? But they couldn't score. They couldn't score.
Yeah, Jack Kemp would have worked out a little bit better than Jeff.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of those things that kind of turn up the lore, so to speak. I mean, the romanticism of that defense.
There's so many people, John, who think that if Randall doesn't get hurt, that they win.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah,
exactly. And you never know the answer to that with injuries. It's hard to say that because there were still too many holes, I think, offensively on that team to say that they were going to go and win the Super Bowl just from, watching in that era, the offensive line specifically.
Ron Heller didn't do it for you? Ron Solt?
Yeah, exactly. And that was the thing with, obviously, Buddy Ryan is a guy who sort of didn't pay attention to the offense. And it basically was, hey, Randall, run around a little bit and make a big play. And the defense, he spent a lot of time on, and you could tell it.
They sure did. That was another thing with that team. They had terrible offensive lines from what I remember. Like, always growing up, they always had the worst offensive line.
That year it was Anton Davis, Ron Heller, and Ron Solt, I remember, because he came over from the Colts and then got caught with steroids.
Yeah, that was a big free agent. He was the Lance Parrish of the Eagles, like this huge free agent signing who just stunk.
With Anton Davis, you're trying with a high-level draft pick, but obviously, it's one of those things. It doesn't necessarily mean if you have a high pick. Look at Greg Robinson, just got traded from the Rams. He was the number 2 overall pick just a few years ago, 2014, I believe. He doesn't even last through his first rookie contract. So, when you draft these guys, fine, but you got to develop them. And I think that was always an issue with those Eagles teams. They just did not do a good job with offensive linemen.
Talking with John McMullen. When did you cover the Vikings?
The Denny Green era, so about 93, 94 up, somewhere in that range.
Were you there in '98 when Randall was there?
Yes. Best team I've ever seen that didn't win the Super Bowl.
I was going to say, that offense, they did the top 30 offenses too. Now, that offense was ranked 30th of the top 30 offenses over the last 30 years.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, I would, because I'm glad you covered that team, because when I saw 30th, I was like, wait a second here. I mean, that team was almost unstoppable.
Yeah, they were. They were the best offense I had seen up to that point. They were phenomenal. That was Randy Moss's rookie season. I think he had
was
17
awesome.
touchdowns. Yeah, and he was the third best receiver on the team. I mean, they had Robert Smith as a running back, who's basically a 1,500-yard guy. In a lot of ways, they finished 15-1 in the regular season. And, Randall wasn't the starting quarterback. The starting quarterback was Brad Johnson. In a lot of ways, I think if Brad Johnson doesn't get hurt, the Vikings probably win 13 games in the regular season, but they probably win the Super Bowl. And Randall, his biggest impact, it was tremendous, obviously, that season. But his ability to throw the deep ball with Randy Moss, I mean, that was just unbelievable.
They ripped off 8 straight wins in a row that season. That offense coordinator, Brian Billick, did go on to win a Super Bowl with the Ravens, so certainly up and down. You look down, that the offensive line coach was Mike Tice. Didn't he go on to be a head coach before he gave away his Super Bowl tickets?
Yeah.
They also.
It's interesting because Dennis Green, the guy I mentioned, was the head coach and just passed away last year. He's a guy, to me, that should be in the Hall of Fame, and he would be in the Hall of Fame if they would have won that Super Bowl, but he's probably not going to make it. Just the impact he had as an African-American coach, how he would have been the first to win a Super Bowl. You mentioned Brian Billick. Tony Dungy was his defensive coordinator, and obviously Tony's a Hall of Fame coach, and he'll tell you that he's nothing compared to Dennis Green, but that's what we always talk about. If you don't win the Super Bowl, you sort of have to have that brass ring, and he never got there, unfortunately.
By the way, a listener just texted into us a picture. This is an awesome picture. It is the cover of the old Eagles Digest. You remember the old Eagles Digest in newspaper form? And on the front cover, it's Clyde Simmons, Jerome Brown, Mike Golick, Reggie White, and Mike Pitts are on the cover of that Eagles Digest, which they don't do that anymore, right? There's no more Eagles Digest, is there? It's all PhiladelphiaEagles.com.
Yeah, it's called PhiladelphiaEagles.com. Dave Spadaro is still there, though.
Yeah, the publisher back then was Thomas Curtis and editor Dave Spadaro. There you go. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. John, tell us what you're working on over for FanRag. I know you were telling me about something that Gruden said that kind of perked your ears up.
Yeah, well, John Gruden, if you think about it, his DNA as a coach is a West Coast guy. He came from really the Bill Walsh tree. He started his first NFL job was in San Francisco under George Seifert, and then he kind of went with Mike Holmgren to Green Bay, and then he was off and running. So he comes from that West Coast tree, and if you've ever seen a West Coast playbook, it is pretty bad with the terminology, the verbiage. And, I remembered back, his show Quarterback Camp he has every year where he talks to all the quarterbacks. And if you go back to when Cam Newton was picked number 1 overall, he got a lot of flack because Gruden gave him one of those West Coast calls. It was absurd. It was about 12 words.
Right.
And Cam Newton came from Auburn, which basically had a Chip Kelly offense, and their offense was putting up a card that said 36 or 40 or 38. That's how they called plays. And what I was saying is since the current CBA came into effect in 2011, you don't have as much time with the quarterbacks to work with them. So even Gruden was admitting, look, it's time to stop with all this nonsense verbiage and make things easier for these quarterbacks. And I thought it was very interesting because he would have been one of the last guys you'd expect to hear that from.
Yeah. So we'll also be covering some more NFL topics throughout the offseason here. As always, stuff happening in the NFL. The Eagles, by the way, Alshon Jeffrey, he was a guy on the list of guys who are on one-year deals who have the most to prove. Him and LeGarrette Blount both made that list. The Eagles that was the one-year prove-it deal. That was very in vogue this offseason.
Yeah, it was, but I think with those two players, it's a little bit different. I think Jeffries is more of a win-win deal, and that the Eagles didn't have the space to give him what he wanted or needed. That's not necessarily a prove-it deal. They kind of know what they have. They just hope he stays healthy. Whereas LeGarrette, that's a legitimate one-year prove-it deal, and there's a lot of those around the NFL this offseason.
All right, John, we'll catch up some more NFL stuff tomorrow. Don't forget, you can follow John on Twitter for all his national coverage at JF McMullen at FanRag Sports NFL. Thanks, pal.
Hey, thank you, guys.